the stories we tell are the stories that belong to us. We have to make sure that the voices are authentic and the voices are telling the story of their lives, not somebody else's take on their lives. Tonight is really about the stories that we control and the stories that we tell. And I've been a storyteller for going on 30 years. I started working in TV news in 1987. My job actually was taking that thing, I don't know what it's called, that it removes staples. That was my first job. I know, right? Don't laugh. That was a paying job. And I removed staples from the wall, WBZ-TV in Boston. But very quickly, I was able to realize where the real power lay in the newsroom. And it actually wasn't with the anchor team, which a lot of people always thought. The real power was with the producers, because the producers would decide whose voices would be elevated and whose voices would not. They literally would decide how much time this person gets and if this person even is in the story at all. I remember my very first live shot as a reporter at KRON-TV in San Francisco. I was reporting on the San Francisco Giants making it into the playoffs. And my husband was very anxious because I don't know a lot about sports. But I sat at this bar, because I went to a bar to interview fans, and they were drinking, and I'm working on my story, and they're drinking, and I'm interviewing them, and they're drinking, and I'm editing my story. You know where this is going. And just as I start doing my live shot, Soledad O'Brien is standing by at Joe's Pub with the very latest for us. Soledad, what's happening? I start to talk, and I realize, like, wow, everybody's so close to me. They're really drunk. And just as I start to talk, someone who's behind me reaches out and pinches me on the behind. I know, right? It's like still traumatic for me. It was terrible. And I don't know if you've ever been so anxious where like time stops and it's like, so that's what happened to me. Mercifully, I couldn't speak. They cut away from me. They ran my piece that I had been working on, came back to me. I managed to kind of get through it. And usually after something terrible happens, someone will come up to you and be like, listen, I know it felt bad, but actually it wasn't so bad on TV. I had the exact opposite thing happen. People are like, oh my God. No, that's the worst thing we have ever seen on television. I stuck it out. I did not quit. And within a few months, actually, I was made the Oakland bureau chief for KRON-TV in San Francisco. And really only made the bureau chief because there was one reporter, which was me. So I made myself, truly, I made myself the bureau chief. And I remember one day in our San Francisco offices, I had come in from Oakland for some meetings in San Francisco. And on that particular day, the bridge was out. And so all of our bosses and all the executives and senior producers actually had to drive through Oakland to come into the office. So you can imagine when people came in, they're like, oh my God, I just took my life in my hands driving through Oakland, which by the way was like an 8-lane highway. So, you know, and over and over, the drama, the chaos, they couldn't believe it. Can you imagine? And so there were two things that I took from that. The first one was, wow, how incredibly obtuse for people who feel free to say this to someone who lives in Oakland and works in Oakland doesn't bother them at all. But the second thing was, these were all the people who were going to be in the morning meeting. And the morning meeting was the meeting that decides the stories that will be told. So in the morning meeting, they would decide the kinds of stories that we would tell out of Oakland. They were literally the people who would assign stories or accept pitches for stories. And you didn't exactly have to be a genius to figure out that the kinds of stories that they felt comfortable with would be the stories around crime and fear, and poverty, and ghettos, exactly how the executives and senior producers who were now coming into the building were telling me how they felt about driving through Oakland. And so the takeaway clearly was, if you see a story out of Oakland, do not be surprised if it doesn't reflect what you know to be true. Don't be shocked if it doesn't have any nuance or any layers. In fact, you might not even recognize yourself in your own story out of Oakland if it was done by someone else's take on your story. Fast forward a few years, I was producing a documentary series called Black in America for CNN. And yeah, it was a great doc series. Great doc series. I'm convinced that doc series is going to get back on the air somewhere, mark my words. That doc series would go on to be one of the most successful in CNN's history, actually. And we were doing the story on a guy named Steve Perry, who was the principal at Capital Preparatory Magnet School. And we told the story of how he had actually built the school in a college. And because of that, his students were all taking college-level classes by 10th grade. So that when anybody would challenge them on, say, their SAT scores, he would say, well, if you're really just trying to see how they're going to do in college biology, here's their grade. They've been taking it. And it was a very interesting strategy on how to help his students. 100% of his students went off to four-year colleges. The star of our story was a young woman named Glorious Menifee. Glorious Menifee, the arc of her story was Glorious trying to get off into college. And as I read the first draft of the script, usually the producer did the first take on it, the script said something like this. Glorious Menifee's mother is a crack addict, and her father is an alcoholic, and she lives in the ghetto. And I remember thinking, like, well, this is not a story of Glorious Menifee. This is a story of the dysfunction in someone's life. It's not her story. It's another story. And I knew, having done this a few 100,000 times, that if, in fact, we were telling the story of a young, suburban, white 12-year-old, let's say, from New Jersey, the story would be more like little Jimmy Smith is 12 years old. He loves baseball. His favorite player is Derek Jeter, and so he recently got a paper route so that he could buy a new glove. Every day, he oils that glove, and he puts that glove under his mattress because little Jimmy, blah, 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 right? Because we actually assign a lot of agency to people who we consider to be middle class, and we take away that agency. We dehumanize people, especially if they're poor, and especially if they're people of color. And by we, I mean the media, of course, right? So we do this all the time. I had a fight with the producer. It actually got pretty nasty, and it got to the point where I was like, I'm just not going to read it, so let's just fix it. And in the end, we said, Glorious Menifee is a B student. She's a peer leader, and she's a starter on the Capital Preparatory Magnet School lacrosse team, where, et cetera, et cetera. It's her story. And I'm not saying that we should cut out any of the drama of her life. It's just not the first thing that introduces her as her story. We have to make sure, and you'll hear everyone's story tonight, that the stories we tell are the stories that belong to us. We have to remember that we have to elevate the voices and the stories that we know to be true. And by that, I do not mean let's just do a Pollyanna, edit down, only put in the stuff that we like. But I mean instead, we have to make sure that the voices are authentic and the voices are telling the story of their lives, not somebody else's take on their lives, which is often very dehumanizing.